Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Lesson 2 of Unit 1 of Social Studies 8 for the first trimester. Today we are going to discuss a very difficult and a very serious subject. We will be answering the essential question, how did the institution of slavery come to America? This is a very painful chapter in the history of the United States as well as the history of Western civilization, and yet it must be taught so that we are honest about history and what happened. It's important that this be a subject that you take seriously. This is not something to make light of. It is a very painful chapter in the history of African Americans. It's a very painful chapter in the history of Native Americans. And it's a very painful chapter in the history of white Americans for different reasons. So, as we approach this subject, I'm going to ask that you give it the seriousness that it deserves. There are 3 slides of notes. I do not expect you to write down every bullet point. I do expect you to write down what you consider to be the most important details about this. But from my point of view, as long as you end up with about 1 page of notes over the next 3 slides, I will be satisfied. And in terms of your test questions, I will be clear as I go through this what you should focus on in terms of being prepared for a potential test. So let's get started. Our essential question is, how did the institution of slavery come to America? If we're being literal, the first slave ship came to the first colony. Jamestown was the destination of the first slave ship ever to arrive in the English colonies. And that was in 1619. So it is often said that slavery began in the Americas in 1619. A ship named the White Lion brought 20 enslaved Africans ashore after seizing them from the Portuguese slave ship, the São João Batista. The Portuguese really started the slave trade, and I should be clear that the slave trade did not just involve America or what later became the United States. In fact, the overwhelming majority of enslaved Africans were taken to Brazil. And the Brazilian population today is largely descended from formerly enslaved people. I also want to be clear, I'm using the term enslaved people instead of slaves because intrinsically they were not slaves, they were enslaved against their will and dehumanized as a result. So the way we use language is important. And I'm trying to be very intentional about that. Throughout the 17th century, so in other words, the 1600s, European settlers in North America turned to enslaved Africans as a cheaper, more plentiful labor source than indentured servants, who were mostly poor Europeans. So there were some people called indentured servants who basically signed a contract to work for wealthier people, and once their contract was fulfilled, they could eventually be released from service. But indentured servitude kind of broke down over the years, and it kind of morphed into just straight up slavery. Under the law, an enslaved person was literally treated as property and could be bought, sold, or given away. Literally, slaves and enslaved people were treated like cattle. They were not given any of the rights of being human or the rights of personhood. And it's a difficult thing to say, but it was the reality. And if we're talking about where in the 13 colonies slavery was most prevalent, it was in the southern colonies, which is not to say there were not slaves in the middle colonies and the New England colonies, but it is to say that the overwhelming majority of enslaved individuals were in the southern colonies, primarily because the southern colonies were based on agriculture. And agriculture is reliant on very inexpensive labor so that the costs of labor are not passed on in the price of food. So, again, I don't expect you to write down every word of every bullet point here. I want you to take a look, what you think is the most important. It would be good to know the name of the ship. It would be good to know that it was in the 17th century that the slave trade really got going. And off to the right there, I have a little blurb that explains kind of what happened in 1619. In the year 2019, a very big deal was made about the fact that it was the 400-year anniversary of the beginning of the slave trade in the Americas, or at least the slave trade that brought enslaved Africans to what later became the United States. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So our next question is something that most people don't know about. And as I did some research to prepare for this lesson, I thought it was important for me to emphasize this as well. What was early slavery in the colonies like? And specifically, we're going to talk about the role of Native Americans in slavery, because we often focus on Africans in slavery for very obvious reasons, but it is not as well known that Native Americans were enslaved as well. So I would like to tell that part of the story. As I just said, it's not widely known that most of the enslaved people in the earlier colonial period, when the colonies first started, were actually Native Americans. So even though that ship arrived in Jamestown in 1619 and it was from Africa, the majority of slavery in the early colonial period was actually essentially capturing and enslaving Native Americans. The British conducted many raids of Native American villages to literally seize able-bodied Native Americans and auction them off as part of the slave trade. Between 1670 and 1715, this trade was an important part of the British Empire's development in the southern colonies. So that's a roughly 45-year period where enslaving Native Americans was as important as enslaving Africans and bringing them across the ocean. And because the Native Americans were already in America, there wasn't the concern of transporting them across the ocean. Slavery did not just exist in the South, as I said before, but because of its agricultural economy, slavery mostly existed in the South. And let's just focus on the obvious fact here that the reason Native Americans were enslaved and the reason Africans were enslaved was deeply rooted in a sense of racism and the notion that European culture and Europeans were somehow naturally superior to the Native American culture or to the African cultures in West Africa. And that's how people at the time justified this morally. And obviously saying that in the year 2021 is difficult because that is not the way we think today. And I think we're all grateful for that. But if we're going to be honest about why this happened and how this happened, it would be impossible to have that discussion without discussing the role of genuine racism. So, if you know that Native Americans were also enslaved and that that was a large part of the slave trade, then you have gotten what you need to get off of this slide. So now we're going to move on to the next slide, which is the last slide, which will involve you taking notes. We're going to discuss the slave trade. And if you look at that picture, it tells a story. And you can see where the thickest arrows are going, and that's to Brazil. So when I mentioned before that Brazil was a much larger destination for enslaved Africans than what later became the United States, you can see by those arrows how it is. You can also see the locations in West Africa where slaves were taken from. And the really sad and tragic part is the slaves were often taken and kidnapped from West Africa with the cooperation of the governments of the places where the slave came from. So literally, in many cases, Africans allowed Africans to be kidnapped. And that's a difficult part of this story, but a nonetheless important one. So what was the slave trade? Well, first of all, it wasn't just the British that engaged in the slave trade. In fact, it started with the Portuguese, but the major Atlantic slave trading nations ordered by trade volume, which simply means, who did it the most, and from then on, the Portuguese did it the most, followed by the British, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the Danish. So many of the colonial European powers were guilty of the slave trade. Some ended it earlier than others, but all were guilty of it. Enslaving West Africans and transporting them to many colonies in the New World was a lucrative business. Slaves were traded for things like rum. It was literally considered a trade of commodities. And there was something called the triangular trade that was very important to sustaining the economy of the colonies. Slaves were literally bought, sold, and auctioned like property, and they were not given rights as human beings. Africans were transported across the Atlantic in very crowded boats and often in chains. And after this slide, I'm actually going to show you 3 different videos that are going to show you what it was like for the slaves, I should say enslaved Africans who were brought from Africa to the Americas. They did finally ban the slave trade after the United States became a country in 1808, but by then it was no longer needed. There were enough enslaved Africans and descendants of enslaved Africans that it was no longer necessary to bring newly enslaved Africans across the ocean because there were enough already living in the colonies that the natural birth rate met the need for new slaves. And that's a sad and difficult thing to say, but that's simply the fact of the matter. So even though the slave trade was banned in 1808, slavery did not end for another 57 years after that. And that is difficult to say, but it just happens to be the truth of the situation. So in terms of what I would like you to take notes on, that is the end of today's lesson. But in terms of what I want you to see and understand about slavery and the slave trade, I'm about to show you in class 3 different videos that will show in very real terms what it was like. But in terms of this particular lesson and in terms of the notes, I'm going to go ahead and stop it here. This is Mr. Blumendahl signing off on the Waldo Middle School Social Studies YouTube network.